And here is just the structure of the report. We're looking at economic outlook of the continent, taking stock of transformation on the continent, but also looking at how to finance that transformation on the continent within the current context of the global financial architecture, and also some recommendations on what African countries need to do more and what the global financing architecture, the global community needs to do more to help that to happen. So here is the growth trends, which the president has already summarized for us. If you look at GDP growth, in terms of real GDP growth, Africa is doing very well, only second to Asia, with 10 of African countries amongst the 20 fastest growing economy. So it's just a story of resilience. If you try to look deeper, you find that up to 15 countries in Africa, estimated to be about 17 this year, post growth of more than 5 percentage points. But we know that that 5% or 4% or 3.8%, 3.1% we have this year is not enough to drive structural transformation on the continent. Our estimate is that Africa needs 7 to 10% of growth consistently for about 40 years before we can break the vicious cycles of poverty. And in this slide, just to show that this growth trend that we are seeing in terms of real GDP growth is also divergent across the countries depending on structures of economies in the regions, but also exposure to shocks, that how they can be able to bolster all the global challenges that the president had already pointed out. And the same is the story when we are looking at different economic groupings, resource-rich countries, non-resource-rich countries, and so on. And funnily enough, on the continent, the non-resource-rich countries are doing better than the resource-rich countries. Again, begging the question of what the president has talked about in terms of how we transparently use our natural capital to leverage resources for growth. And here is what I call, when you look at what I call the paradox of development on the continent, where you have rich resources, high growth rates in terms of GDP, but low performance in terms of achieving, improving the welfare of people, and also addressing SDG outcomes. If you look at one indicator, which is GDP per capita, we'll find that the continent has not been doing as well as we saw with regard to GDP growth rate. The continent has trailed other regions consistently for decades in terms of GDP per capita, and that because of that, the growth rates we have not created enough jobs for youth. There's persistent poverty, there's debt vulnerability and recurrent debt distress, but also several other fragilities across the continent. And I've already said that for us to transform, we need much higher growth. Here we're looking at the growth, the dynamics within Africa's macroeconomic fundamentals, be it on inflation or depreciation in currencies. We see that Africa is also not doing very well because of several endogenous and exogenous factors. Our consumer price inflation rose this year to about 17%, up from 14% last year, and several countries saw depreciations in their local currencies because of the strengthening of the US dollar and other domestic factors. The president has already talked about the debt. The good news here is that the stock of debt is tapering. The rise of debt to GDP growth rates is tapering, estimated to be around 60% by the end of 2024. But the challenge is that the strength of the dollar has increased a lot of the spread between African countries. Since the fiscal tightening that we've seen post-COVID-19, the spread for Africa has increased 3 times more than other emerging countries. And then currency also being denominated in the dollar, about 70% of Africa's stock of debt is dollar denominated, and a lot of move away from normal low concessional, low-cost financing to high-cost short-term private sector financing also has strong implications for debt and debt vulnerability on the continent. And this slide is just showing us, because of all this confluence of changes in the structure of debt, we are now seeing that debt service payments for our external debt is rising so sharply that is actually taking resources away from structural transformation, economic development, and other things we need to do. The president have talked already about the $74 billion that is supposed to be paid in debt service. 40 billion of that is from the private sector. And we see also in our analysis that MDBs are actually a good model for financing structural transformation on the continent. Looking at the costs of debt, Africa pays about 500 percentage points more when they are borrowing from the international capital market than if it's borrowing from the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other MDBs. The other challenge we are seeing is refinancing risks, which will be rising for countries that have large bullet payments due, including Kenya and several other countries. And if you look at the report, you will see all the details. And amid all these issues, now we're going into the global financing architecture, when Africa needs a lot more resources to address climate change, address all the challenges of the geopolitical tensions we're seeing. If you look at all external flows collectively, it's been declining significantly on the continent by 19.4 percentage points between 2022 and 2021. FDI, which many times we all look towards, has declined by 44% in 1 year. And ODA has declined by about 6%, and only remittances has remained a bit stable. If we look at this, then it's the paradox of Africa, where we have good potentials and good opportunities, but high perception of risk is creating high cost of debt and all those confluence of factors I've mentioned. And if, the president has already cited this report, Moody's Analytics, that shows the default rates in long-term infrastructure on the continent being 1.9% compared to 12.4% in Eastern Europe, and other regions are much higher. So we see a vicious cycle where the continent doesn't have access to resources because of high perception of risk. They are then not investing more. They are even paying more for the little they are able to access, and that leads to low capital investment in structural transformation projects. And that locks Africa into poverty, as we've talked about. But the caveat here is that it's not just external factors. We have several internal factors that the countries need to deal with. And here, the point I would like to make is that there is no substitute for sound macroeconomic policy management on the continent. Once you do that, you're able to reduce the perception of risk, you're able to reduce the cost of capital, you're able to leverage resources even more. So as Africans, we need to do a little bit more to address that challenge. And because of corruption and poor institutions and others, we are seeing that capital flight from the continent, illicit financial flows, payments because of poor perception of risks, or the cost of corruption itself, which we estimate to be about 148 billion annually for the continent, and also international profit shiftings in the global markets for Africa, about 275 billion. So if you look at all the outflows, just these few indicators we looked at, which is not comprehensive, Africa is already losing almost 600 billion annually. So can you imagine if we did good macroeconomic policy, good rule of law and regulation, accountability that the president was talking about, and we will be able to save that resources on the continent. All the external flows we got in the same year when we measured this is around 175 billion. So multiples of what we get is leaving the continent annually for things that African countries can address. Here are just some risks to watch on the continent in terms of macroeconomic performance. The high interest rates and debt service costs we have talked about, dependence on commodity with very low value addition and high price volatility, regional conflicts and political instability that is rising on the continent, climate shocks that is costing the continent sometimes up to 15% of GDP, and persistent inflationary pressures we have talked about. And because of these challenges we have now seen, we move into the report, and this is what I call the development paradox in Africa, where we have high resource potential, we have high economic growth performance in terms of rich GDP, but we are performing poorly with regard to SDG outcomes. This is again looking in at a longer term on GDP per capita, and you see that Africa has been trailing other regions. And in terms of structural transformation, the reallocation of labor from lower to higher productivity sectors, we see that many Africans are still locked in the low productivity sectors, in agriculture, in services, wholesale, and so on. And in this graph, you can see that there are large gaps in the lower productivity sectors. And the only sectors that are performing a bit better is like mining, services, and utilities, most of which those resources are not largely African, because the Africans are not highly employed in that. So the president has already made very clear, increasing productivity in agriculture and in all those sectors where we are employed will help to drive GDP per capita up in Africa. And this is just looking at sectoral shifts, which is how you measure structural transformation. So in Africa, unlike other regions, we are seeing shifts from agriculture to other sectors, but then the productivity of those sectors remain low, primarily because people are not shifting because of capital accumulation in terms of human capital, but because of other push factors like climate change pushing people out of agriculture, but also insecurity in rural communities pushing people out of agriculture. We have to reverse that trend because we see that in manufacturing, the growth in productivity has only been 0.6% when you look at that. And this is just looking at the stages of structural transformation in Africa. We're seeing that technically, you can say structural transformation is happening because labor is being reallocated from agriculture to other sectors. But like I have mentioned, that is not really happening because it's reallocation from poverty to poverty in many ways. And then you look at labor productivity by regions, you see again the same way different countries actually not transforming, seeing negative labor productivity like in Central Africa. So we need to look at that in more detail. Shares of domestic value added in exports, you also see that is decreasing from agriculture and manufacturing, but also increasing in many sectors, typically export services, which we call servicification of Africa's structural growth. But if you look at technology content in exports, the same way Africa lags other regions, and we have not seen major changes across decades of the continent, that we looked at. And then key drivers of structural transformation, there's quite a number of things that you can look at, but the president has already summarized it a lot, is that little blue thing on the ground, macroeconomic policy environment. When we get that right, all the other things fall into place. Deal with corruption, deal with illicit financial flows, and other things, and then you will see economies growing a lot better. Here is the financing, how we estimated the financing gap. I'm not going to go into detail because of time, but just to say that we have 402.2 billion in financing gap for Africa to be able to catch up structurally. And they are in those sectors that the president have already mentioned, which I will not repeat, energy, agriculture, and the rest of it. On the right side is also to indicate that we have this estimation for each country and each region. So please read the report and you can see what percentage of your GDP you need to invest in order to move forward. Improving efficiency in domestic revenue mobilization is always the key, but revenue utilization is also the major thing that we need to do more on the continent. On both sides, we need to improve. Africa's tax to GDP ratio is still very low, 13.6% compared to others, and that's also how the tax capacity is, very low at 20%. So Africa trails others even in collection of VAT. Last year, we collected only 24% of VAT that could have been collected if we improved efficiency and so on. Then here is a big question. Can domestic revenue mobilization alone and better utilization of those resources address structural transformation and fill the gaps for us in Africa? Yes and no. For some countries, depending on the structure of their economy and where they are with the efficiency in tax collection and the efficiency in use of resources, they can, but many other countries cannot. So on average, Africa still needs a lot to do in terms of mobilizing foreign capital in order to be able to address the issues of structural transformation. Value addition to critical rare earth minerals provides a low-hanging fruit for Africa. If you look at only three critical, four that we mentioned there, copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium, a lot of which Africa has so much. The market is growing so fast and will grow by about 3.5% in terms of demand for critical minerals for green transition. Africa is projected to, currently, if business as usual continues, harness about 10% of the 16 trillion market over the 25 years coming. But Africa can do more to some of the policies you will see in the report in order to leverage better of these resources. But again, investing in productive infrastructure is key, because while the debt markup we see on the continent has been driven by investing in infrastructure, we also see from the data that inefficiencies in the investment, even in the decisions of the projects that we invest in, contribute to poor effectiveness of debt for growth on the continent. So, and this is just to tell us that we also then need to balance knowledge and economic governance and all those soft issues as we try to mobilize resources for infrastructure. And here is a vicious cycle which summarizes everything we are seeing. I've talked about it, and the sound alarm that I want to make here is that 9 out of 10 of the world's extremely poor by 2030 will be in Africa if we continue with business as usual. And it will take Africa about a century, 108 years, to be able to transition to higher productivity. And even countries that have managed to get to middle income are likely to be trapped in the middle income trap. 26 African countries already seen that phenomenon, that in the past 10 years, they have been in and out of that income class. So we really, really need to change and change urgently. So in this, we are then looking at what are the issues we see with the current global financial architecture that is limiting access to resources in Africa. One, of course, has supported Africa greatly during crisis, but those supports have been episodic, counter-cyclical support, and we see recurrent downside trends and risks re-emerging, like in debt. We get debt relief, debt comes back, and so on and so forth. Global Commons challenges have changed the nature of the challenges that need to be addressed, and we need to reform to get to that. And the inequalities, lack of access to resources, inability to deliver climate finance, concessional finance, and all the other things that the president has talked about requires that we need to change. But inclusiveness and voice for Africa is also a major point to look at there. Now, the major point we find there is that affordability, timeless, and economies of scale matters. We can support Africa as much as we can, but if the scale of support is not up to the point that can deliver economies of scale, we are not really moving, and that's what we are seeing on the continent. Access to all emergency financing facilities in the world, in Africa, has been very far short of what is needed to reach economies of scale. I'm not going to mention all of them because of time. But the same way, concessional financing access has remained low and is declining on the continent. Here we just use a metric of the ADF replenishment. But if you do the same analysis with IDA replenishment and other things, you will still find that the stack of all the concessional resources we get on the continent is not enough to be able to address the issues that we need to address. And here, the hope for bilateral ODA and bilateral debt is also not very positive. You can see on the left side there, bilateral debt is decreasing from different countries, and also a number of countries have not been meeting even the 0.7% of GDP that was required. Africa's access to external financial flows, therefore, remain low if major reforms are not done. And here is just mapping official development assistance in the past decade, foreign direct investment, and remittances. You see the proportion for the world and for Africa is still very, very low. And we see that despite the shifting composition of public debt towards private creditors, MDBs has remained a constant and good partner for Africa. You can see on the right side here that the World Bank and the African Development Bank alone constitutes almost 70% of MDB resources coming to the continent. And if you look at that left side on the bottom, the support has remained constant, even when the higher cost, shorter term private sector financing has been growing and complicating the debt architecture of the continent. We recognize and really are very grateful to the global community, the World Bank, IMF, and everyone for the reforms that's going on, because that already, from our work, is going to deliver if all the recommendations, the capital adequacy framework, the SDR, rechanneling, and IMF's lending in arrears policy, and even if we reform the credit rating agencies' methodologies, that will deliver to Africa about $169.4 billion in US dollars. But that still is not enough. So countries need to do as much in order to complement what the global community is already doing in order to deliver resources for the continent. What are some of the key policy recommendations? African governments need to focus on a number of things. In the report, you will find the separate recommendations to address macroeconomic stability, to address all the issues in the different chapters. But here we just summarize what are the recurring themes. African governments need to develop and consistently implement endogenous development plans. We see in our research that sometimes development plans are not followed consistently. Scaling up domestic resource mobilization and utilization, we have also talked about it. And then natural capital accounting, beneficiation, and conservation. This is key and can lift a lot of resources for the continent. But deepening capital markets could also become a source of local currency financing. But we can't deepen capital markets, we can't deepen regional integration in Africa if there are so many non-trade barriers for that to happen. Movement of labor and all those things that we've been talking about. Macroeconomic policy reforms to leverage resources more, both private and public, is there, but also having a collective voice. The Africa Rating Agency has been talked about, and more importantly, mindset change on how we relate with African products and African markets. If Africans don't buy African products, we're not going to see structural transformation happening. And then also establishing an emergency financing facility for the continent, human capital development, and so on. For the international communities, MDBs, DFIs, and bilateral partners, quite a number of things that could be done, but priority is accelerating low-cost concessional financing for Africa so that it can help leverage the private sector and others. And this is where the call that was made by President Ruto on the replenishment of ADF comes very handy, and also replenishment of IDA, but calling also on the ODA countries to meet their commitments, as SDR channeling and so on is very, very important. Implementing the capital adequacy framework of the G20 and the triple agenda, reforming the global debt architecture to become more nimble and equitable. We need to look at the credit rating agency methodologies, the IMF, World Bank, debt and sustainability framework. There's quite a lot that has happened already, looking at what could change in that will deliver huge outcomes. Simplifying climate finance architecture to align with climate vulnerability and the scale of loss and damage is critical, because we see that on the continent, meager resources are invested, but climate change washes them off. So we need to look at that. Leveraging private sector financing is also another thing that the global community need to help Africa to be able to do, but improving the international tax reform will be very important to curb profit shifting and so on and so forth. Governance reforms to make it more inclusive is very important as well, and a lot of them are already doing this, but access to global financial safety nets and delinking it from quotas, because safety nets is meant to help people in emergency, countries in emergency. But if it's linked to quotas based on income, poor countries will never get enough. And that's what we saw in SDR and all the other things that has happened. But we also need to focus on accelerating low-cost financing for Africa. Specifically on global safety nets, because it's urgent, we make 3 recommendations, which you can see in the report. I've already talked about it. And in conclusion, we just want to go back to wise words of Albert Einstein. In the middle of all these challenges and difficulties the world is going through, there is an opportunity to do things differently. And we cannot use the old map to explore the new world.